Hi there. Welcome to another lecture video, Writing Chapter 5, the Summary, Conclusion, and Recommendation. Summary, conclusion, and recommendation are the final components of a research paper, providing a summary of the study's findings, the researcher's conclusions based on the findings, and recommendation for future research or for practice. As you can see in the current slide, you can follow this structure in writing your chapter 5. You can first write the summary, followed by the conclusion, and finally the recommendation. For the recommendation, you can put there recommendation for implementation and recommendation for future practice. So we will discuss each of these in this tutorial. So what is the summary section? In the summary section, the researcher will briefly recap the main findings of the study, highlighting the key results and their implications. As you can see here in this current slide, we have a summary. So this is an example summary of a research study. So in this summary, the researchers summarize the problem that they investigated in their study, the methods that they conducted in investigating that particular topic, the results of their investigation, and finally, the highlights based on these results. So you can also follow the same structure when writing the summary section of your research paper. After the summary section is the conclusion section. The conclusion is intended to help the reader understand why your research should matter to them after they have finished reading the paper. Take note that a conclusion is not merely a summary of your points or a restatement of your research problem, but it should be a synthesis of key points of your paper. For most uh, research paper, a one well-developed paragraph is sufficient for a conclusion, although in some instances, a 2 or 3 paragraph conclusion may be required, as you can see here in this example. So you can find here a sample conclusion where the researcher first stated the following conclusions were drawn from this research. So this should also remind us that the conclusion should not just be from anywhere, but it should be drawn out of the results, out of the findings of your research. So you can write your conclusion in a numbered form or in a paragraph format. Why is it that a good conclusion section matters? A well-written conclusion provides you with several important opportunities to demonstrate your overall understanding of the research problem to the reader. So you have to mind the reader when writing the conclusion. First, it's presenting the last word on the issues you raised in your paper. If you can still remember, in your introduction, you raise an issue. So just as the introduction gives a first impression to your reader, the conclusion offers a chance to leave a lasting impression also. Do this, for example, by highlighting key points in your analysis or findings. So what are the key points in your analysis or findings? So this should be presented in your conclusion. Second, it summarizes your thoughts and convey the larger implications of your study. Take note that the conclusion is an opportunity to succinctly answer the "so what" question by placing the study within the context of past research about the topic you've investigated. So this is also the reason why in writing the conclusion, you may also refer to the results of past researchers, and you have to think whether your research were able to advance the understanding of those past research, or are there some anomalies in the results that needs to be investigated further. Third is it demonstrates the importance of your ideas. So you don't have to be shy when writing the conclusion. It offers you the chance to elaborate the significance of your findings. It also matters because it introduces possible new or expanded ways of thinking about the research problem. So this does not refer to introducing new information, which should be avoided, but it should offer new insight and creative approaches for framing, contextualizing the research problem based on the results of your study. So take note of these things, why a good conclusion section really matters. So how do we write and structure, approach the conclusion section? Take note that the function of your paper's conclusion is to restate the main argument. So it reminds the reader of the strength of your main arguments and reiterates the most important evidence supporting those arguments. So make sure, however, that your conclusion is not simply a repetitive summary of the findings, because this reduces the impact of the arguments you have developed in your paper. So state your conclusion in a clear, simple language. Do not simply reiterate results or the discussion. Indicate opportunity for future research as long as you haven't already done this in the discussion section of your paper. Here are some points to remember in addition to those general rules. So consider these points to help ensure that your conclusion is appropriate. First, if your argument or point of your paper is complex, you may need to summarize the argument for your reader. So the importance of summarizing this argument for the sake of the reader is for them to understand it, not just you simply presenting an argument. If prior to your conclusion that you have not explained the significance of your findings, or if you are proceeding inductively, use the end of your paper to describe your main points and explain their significance. Move from a detailed to a general level of consideration that returns the topic to the context provided by the introduction or within a new context that emerges from the data. So if these are the things that you have to remember, these are also to avoid when writing the conclusion. First is being failure to be concise in writing the conclusion. So take note that the conclusion should be concise and to the point. Conclusions are that are too long often have unnecessary detail. So the conclusion is not the place for details about your methodology or results. Although you should give a summary of what was learned from your research, this summary should be relatively brief, since the emphasis in the conclusion is on the implications, evaluations, insights that you make. Second is failure to comment on larger or more significant issues. Take note the introduction, your task was to move from general, which is the field of your study, to a specific, which is your research problem. However, in the conclusion, your task is to move from specific, which is your research problem, back to the general or the field, how your research contributes new understanding or fills an important research gap in the literature. So in other words, the conclusion is where you place your research within a larger context. Third is failure to reveal problems and negative results. Negative results of the research process should never be ignored. Problems, drawbacks, and challenges encountered during your study should be included as a way of qualifying your overall conclusions. So if you encountered negative results, those findings that are validated outside the research context in which they were generated, you must report them in the results section of your paper. In the conclusion, use these negative results as an opportunity to explain how they provide information on which future research can be based. Next is failure to provide a clear summary of what was learned. So in order to be able to discuss your research fits back into your field of study and possibly the world at large, you need to summarize it briefly and directly. Often this element of your conclusion is only a few sentences long. And failure to match the objective of your research. Often research objectives change while the researcher is your research is being carried out. So this is not a problem unless you forget to go back and refine your original objectives in your introduction. As these changes emerge, they must be documented so that they accurately reflect what you were trying to accomplish in your paper, not what you thought you might accomplish when you began. So there should be a match between your conclusion and your objective. And finally, avoid the urge to apologize in your conclusion. So if you've immersed yourself in studying the research problem, you now know a good deal about it, perhaps even more than your professor. Nevertheless, by the time that you have finished writing, you may have some doubts about what you have produced. So repress those doubts. Do not undermine your authority by saying something like, this is just one approach to examining this problem, or there may be other or much better approaches. So do not apologize in your conclusion. So now that we've learned how to structure, how to write, what to avoid in your conclusion section, moving now to the recommendation section. The recommendation section is where you offer suggestions for practical application of the study's findings. These recommendations may be directed towards policymakers, practitioners, or other stakeholders in the field, especially your target beneficiaries or end users of your study. So the purpose of the recommendation section is to provide guidance on how the research can be improved, can be used to improve practices or policies related to the topic. Also, recommendations should include suggestions for future research to further explore the implications of your study's findings. So in writing your recommendation, you may follow the sample format here. You may write first the recommendations for future or for implementation. It means how how this research can be used for practice or for implementation with regards to the problem that you have that you're trying to solve or that you're trying to find solution. And finally, you can also separately discuss the recommendations for further research. So there are things that needs to be explored, and this is your time to recommend uh, how other researchers can further explore on the study on the topic that you have just presented. Example, how you could write this chapter 5 of your paper. Say, for example, we have a hypothetical study entitled Development of a New Material for Use in Structural Applications. So a good summary could be written this way. So this study describes the development and testing of a new composite material for use in structural applications. So as you can see in the first sentence, the The researcher describes what the research is all about, and then they followed it by writing the material consists of a thermoplastic matrix reinforced with high strength carbon fibers. A series of mechanical tests were performed on the material to evaluate its strength, stiffness, and durability. So as you can see, after introducing what the topic of their study, they move on to describing the methods of their study, and then followed by saying the results show that the new material has significantly higher strength and stiffness compared to traditional materials such as steel and aluminum alloys, while also exhibiting good resistance to fatigue and environmental degradation. So after discussing the methods, they discuss the results, the highlights, the key findings of their study. In the summary, you may also discuss or present specific numbers if it is applicable in your research. So this is just how you can write the summary. It doesn't have to be long. A one paragraph will do as long as it covers the very important points. And this is how a conclusion could be written based on the same title. In conclusion, the results of this study demonstrate that the new composite material has promising mechanical properties for use in structural applications. So this conclusion is based on the results, as they have stated that the results of this study demonstrates these things. So make sure that when you conclude, it should always go back from your results. The high strength and stiffness of the material make it an attractive alternative to traditional materials, particularly in applications where weight reduction and durability are important considerations. I like the second part because they are now placing the results of their study in a larger context on how the results of their study can be applied to practical ap- practical issues or applications. And then followed by, however, further research is needed to optimize the manufacturing process and to evaluate the long-term performance of the material under different environmental conditions. So they not only conclude, but they also give some possible uh, research exploration that can be done for future research. So even if this conclusion is just one paragraph, it really summarizes the most important findings of the research. Finally, you can write your recommendation for implementation in this way. For this study, based on the findings of this study, we recommend that the new composite material be further evaluated for use in structural applications. The material's high strength, stiffness, and durability make it a promising candidate for a variety of applications, including aerospace, automotive, and civil engineering. So based on these statements, they are recommending uh, some important things that should be done first, which is evaluation of the structural applications of this new material before it can be really used for implementation. Recommendation for further study. This is an example on how you can state it. Further research is needed to optimize the manufacturing process and to assess the material's long-term performance in real-world conditions. We also recommend that future studies investigate the economic feasibility of using the new material, including the costs associated with manufacturing, processing, and transportation. Finally, we suggest that efforts be made to educate engineers and designers about the benefits and limitations of the new material in order to facilitate its adoption in industry. So they are now giving opportunities for future studies based on their study. Structure on how you can Write a good summary, conclusions, and recommendation of your research paper. So best efforts in your research writing.